Beyond the Bright Sea, Chapter 34. I crossed back over to Osh with a glad heart. Mr. Johnson had spoken to me as he would have to anyone, and he had come closer than he ever had. My head wondered why I cared what he thought or said or did, but I liked the idea of forgiveness, and by the time I reached our island, dripping with my cold Atlantic wash, I felt lighter than I had in a long time. What did he want? Osh asked. I read the telegram to him. Kendall arrested pawning jewelry. Come to Ash Street Jail. Soonest. Kelly, stop. Well, that's something, Osh said. The man's a fool, pawning those things right off like that, with the police looking for him. It's good he's not too smart, I said. Now we can stop worrying about him. But Osh didn't seem convinced. They'll need us, and the real bird keeper, to say it was him we saw on Pennickey's. And here too, I said. No, not here. Osh stood up, brushing the sand from his damp clothes. They can't know he got that jewelry from us. But he would have hurt us, I cried, and he ruined your paintings. He should be punished for that. I'll paint new ones, Osh said. They'll put him in jail for hurting Mr. Sloane. No need to tell them about the treasure. I could see the wisdom in that, but I expected Mr. Kendall would do the telling. What will we do if he says he got those things from us? Osh led the way slowly toward the house. Let him, he said. He can't say a word without admitting that he stole them on top of everything else. But if he does tell them, won't they want to know where we got the jewelry? Then we tell them the truth, Osh said. Your mother left it to you when she died. Except when they find out that my mother is buried on Pennickey's, they'll know. They'll say she found the treasure on state land, and then they'll take it away, just like he did. Maybe, Osh paused in the doorway, and then they'll go away too and leave us alone. But that's wrong, Osh. He looked at me curiously. Most of the treasure is still yours, he said, worth more than any person could ever need. Why are you so concerned with these few small pieces? Because some rich woman will end up with them, and she'll feel like a queen, even though they came from Pennickey's where she never would have stepped foot, or sent peaches in the summer, or figs in the winter, or soft blankets, or anything. Osh sighed. Time to let that go now, he said. I can't, I said. It's not right. Osh turned to go into the house. Maybe not, he said, but I've said all I've got to say about it. He paused. Except this. Those lepers were out there for years while we were right here, just across the water. But we never sent peaches or figs or blankets. We never stepped foot out there either. I felt like I couldn't breathe, like my heart had a nail in it. I know that, Osh, I said, my throat aching. And then I cried for a long time and dried my eyes and breathed again and let some of that go. We stayed in all the mess and misery of the house only as long as we had to, trading our wet clothes for dry, finding our shoes, trying not to look at anything else. I retrieved the cinnamon box from the sand outside my window, achingly grateful that I had that, still, and tucked it in the bottom of our driftwood bin for the time being, though I could not imagine that Mr. Kendall would ever come back. Then we went to fetch Miss Maggie, who was a witness too, and waited while she put Cinders and Clover out to graze and got herself ready for the trip. This is all very hard to believe, she muttered as we hurried down the path toward the fish pier. One day I'm tending sheep, the next I'm mixed up with a madman. At the gangway, Miss Maggie bought our tickets. You can pay me back in lobsters, she said, though Osh always sent some up to her regardless. We were all three jittery and grim, just hours past a terrible night, but the day was fair, we were together, and Mr. Kendall was caught and jailed where he couldn't hurt us. Perhaps, as well, I would learn something about the Shearwater and whether she had come back to New Bedford when she might return. I wish you could have seen Jason when I did, I said as we stood at the rail and watched the mainland grow and grow. He saw me just when I saw him, and he looked so much like me. It was amazing. You were happy about that, weren't you? Osh said. What? That he looked like me? He nodded. The sun behind him made it difficult to see his face. Yes, I was happy about that. Why shouldn't I be? Oh, you should, I suppose, he said, though he sounded doubtful. But that's just one thing, how he looked. Not enough to prove that he's your brother. I realized what he was saying. You don't think he is, do you? He shrugged. Maybe he is. I turned to Miss Maggie. I suppose he could be, she said, but I didn't mind how unsure they seemed. If it turned out that they were right, I would keep looking. I would find my brother, wherever he was. Mrs. Pelham would help with that. In the meantime, I would think of that sailor the way I had since I first saw him, as Jason, as my brother, and hope that it was so. Otherwise, I'd spent far too much time atop the Cunninghut drumlins looking for the wrong ship. We asked a dockhand where the jail was, and he told us straight up Union. So straight up Union we went, block after block, watching for something that looked like a jail. We passed the turn for the hospital, and I was tempted to go back in and search for Mrs. Pelham, who knew and loved Jason the way I meant to do. But we had different business that day, and it took us to a big brick building I recognized immediately as a jail. It felt like one, even before we went inside. Strong, stern, as serious as any building I'd ever seen. The officer at the desk took us to a windowless room where we waited for a long time, far too hot, and I, for one, began to feel like a prisoner myself. Osh fell asleep, his chin on his chest, and Miss Maggie watched him while I tried not to be afraid of what would come next. You got here so quickly, Officer Kelly said when he joined us. Osh opened his eyes. You wrote soonest, Miss Maggie said. This is soonest. Well, I'm sorry you had to wait. We were rounding up men who looked like Mr. Kendall. It wasn't easy. What for? I imagined a room full of big, ugly, angry men. The show up, he said. You'll look at a number of men and pick out the one you saw on Pennickey's. Osh stood up, Miss Maggie with him, and I said, will he have to see us? Ah, Officer Kelly smiled. Every witness would like to be anonymous, but he already knows you saw him. He's already said some things about you, young lady. And you, he said, tipping his head at Osh and Miss Maggie. But he won't be able to hurt you, I promise. Where's Mr. Sloane? I asked. Why can't he do this part? In Maine, he said. Back home, after what happened to him on Pennickey's. He'll be along soon enough. His word alone won't be as strong, though, as his and yours both. Before he took us up for the show-up, Officer Kelly stopped in the doorway and said, You were in the Pennickey's graveyard last time we saw you. Miss Maggie nodded. Tending the graves. So you said, but I've been curious about that ever since. Why would you tend those graves? Because they needed tending, she said. Why else? But why those graves? Why sail all the way to Pennickey's to tend the graves of people you never knew? My parents are buried there, I said, before Miss Maggie could say another word. I would not lie about this. Officer Kelly almost smiled. I wondered, he said. We went back again, Officer Reardon and I, making sure Kendall wasn't hiding out there, and we found one of the graves all dug up and a little trunk lying open and empty. We figured he had been there all right, still looking for the treasure, and had found it. We just can't understand why he had so little loot with him when the trunk was big enough to hold much more. We said nothing. Osh kept his eyes on the floor. Of course, he denies having anything besides what he took to the pawn shop. He claims the jewelry belonged to his grandmother. Nothing wrong with pawning what's mine, he said, but we have our doubts. He looked at each of us in turn. You wouldn't know anything about all that, would you? Why would anyone dig up a grave, I said, especially where lepers are buried? That's exactly what we asked him, Officer Kelly said, but he wouldn't say. They could have showed us 1,000 big, flat-faced men, and we would have known Mr. Kendall in a trice. It was how he looked, yes, but it was also how he looked at us, as if his eyes alone could do us harm. And they did. I felt them on me and shivered. This was not a reasonable man. This was not someone who could be made to see sense. When we all three pointed at him and said 5 for the number pinned to his chest, he lunged at us, screaming, "You'll be sorry!" And it took 3 officers to hold him back. "Where's the rest of it?" he screamed as they took him away in handcuffs. "It's mine, and I'll have it. I'll have what's mine." Osh stepped in front of Miss Maggie and me. "Come on," he said, "let's go." He shepherded us into the corridor and away to where we could no longer hear Mr. Kendall screaming. We'd already given our statement back on the island. We'd done what we'd come to do. So we signed some papers, Osh with an X, and said our goodbyes. "I hope we never see you again," Osh said to Officer Kelly, who unexpectedly smiled. "I hear that a lot," he said, "and I hope so too, though you'll have to come to court eventually to say under oath what you know." We were mostly quiet on the walk back to the waterfront, the jail and Mr. Kendall behind us, receding. We considered stopping for a sandwich or a visit to one of the things that islands lacked. A museum, a theater, a library that held 10,000 books, but all we really wanted was to be on the Elizabeths again, even if that meant facing the wreck of our home. When we reached the waterfront, I saw the old dockmaster coming along toward us, the smoke from his pipe trailing behind him like a dirty veil, and I hurried ahead to meet him. "Excuse me, but can you tell me if the Shearwater is in port?" I asked. He squinted at me, his long beard quivering as he slowed to a stop, huffing like a steam engine. "That I can," he said, "and the answer is no, she's not, nor has been for weeks, stuck in dry dock in Portland after a run-in with a shoal. But home soon, I expect." He craned his neck to look back down the dock and then again along the waterfront. "One of her cabin boys was here just a few days ago, come back on another ship, but he wouldn't have more to tell you than I have." So, not here, but home soon. And through the graveyard she'd come, and I'd be watching. "Come along, Crow," Miss Maggie said, nodding to the dockmaster as we continued on toward the ferry that was tied up and napping, waiting to be let off her leash again. And I believe we were all three content as we boarded for the return trip, our duty done, not knowing what was to come next.